So alright guys, in today's video I want to talk about a really cool circuit that I stumbled across online. Essentially this is a blocking oscillator. Well, a blocking oscillator without blocking oscillator components. Now for the more keen-eyed individuals out there that know a bit about electronics, you may have noticed in my B-roll here, this looks awfully similar to a Joule Thief circuit. Well, in a sense it is. Essentially, it's a dumbed down Joule Thief without the components needed to get it to function properly. Normally, you need a couple resistors as well as some capacitors to ensure that you don't blow out your LED. But in the case of this circuit, since we're utilizing DIY batteries, we don't really need to worry about the resistance because the high resistance of our battery will ensure that the LED will not burn out and that this thing will oscillate. But before I continue on and show the circuit simulation for this thing, I want to give credit where credit is due. Now I knew about this circuit for a couple of years, but I never really knew where it came from, and I think I figured out exactly where it came from today. Ironically, I stumbled across it while looking up various low-powered kinetic sculptures. The channel name in question is called Lid Motor. Now this is apparently one of his circuits that's been modified by another German YouTuber, so I'll be sure to link both their channels in the description if you wish to check them out. But with that said, the way this works, now that I have the circuit simulation up, I will actually go more in depth into this than both those channels did. In those channels, they don't really show any simulations, so I pulled up the circuit in a simulator here, and I want to demonstrate why it is that this thing is as efficient as it is, and how it works. So with that said, as you can see here, just imagine this battery on the left is our high resistance battery. This could be anything from just some plain tap water with a copper and zinc electrode in it to like a salt battery or a dirt battery. Essentially what happens here is the energy from our DIY battery goes into this capacitor, and when this capacitor gets super saturated and starts to fill up this 1 megahenry inductor, our transistor will then begin to fire. And since we have another 1 megahenry inductor hooked up to our collector, think of these inductors like springs, so the energy gets stored into the capacitor as well as these two inductors. One releases right away while the other one builds up. Now this buildup in energy in the collector inductor here gets dumped into our LED as a high voltage inductive kick, essentially raising our 0.6 volts up to about a volt or two, which is just enough to fire this LED. Another thing you might have noticed is I don't have this LED connected the way it should be connected. Normally in a Joule Thief or any other circuit like this, you would connect your LED from the collector to the emitter. And if I were to raise our voltages up here, you should see this circuit actually work. As you can see, it works fairly well at higher voltages, but what you also noticed is at lower voltages, it does not work. But when we connect the LED up to the collector of our transistor, it will actually fire. Now the reason for this is you have this inductor to thank and some of the spare capacitance that's in the actual NPN transistor itself. So normally the energy here would be wasted into the emitter, but since we have the LED hooked up to it, it's just going into that LED. Essentially, as the capacitor goes, it charges, it fires, and the cycle repeats. Now depending on how high resistant your battery is, you'll get nice oscillations like this. However, in reality, these oscillations happen extremely fast. Now to my naked eye, the LEDs just look like they're turned on. But as the batteries get depleted, or I increase the resistance, they do begin to oscillate just like the videos that I've seen this circuit from do. Now you may be asking yourself why I took the time to talk about this. Well, I plan to use this circuit to power some of my low-powered kinetic sculptures, sure, but I also really liked how efficient it is. I also thought it would make for really cool DIY kind of emergency road signs. You could have a sign with two spikes in it, one copper, one zinc, and let's say you get into a car crash, you could stick the sign in the ground and it should just light up all without a battery, so you won't have to worry about having a battery for your sign, or have to rely on the sun in order to get it to work. Now there's even more cooler things that you could do with a circuit like this, such as like spill detectors that are very analog based, like no battery needed. All you would have to do is stick a copper and zinc anode into a, well, sponge and put these LEDs on the outside of your project, and if for whatever reason liquid gets into your project box, you would know right away that liquid got in there because the LEDs would be lit. And they would stay lit for a pretty long time. In fact, I have some B-roll up on screen probably right now of me just dipping some pennies with some gator clips on, one penny's sanded, one is not, into a jar of water. Believe it or not, this has stayed lit for multiple days now. Now, you can actually do this with any kind of electrolytic medium. I hooked it up to some of my dirt cell batteries and it worked great. In fact, I have one that's been running for about a week now and I haven't needed to water it at all. But yeah, back onto the topic at hand, and with the simulation back on screen, there's a couple things we can do here to optimize this even further. Essentially, all the stored energy gets put into the collector inductor here, so you can actually raise the inductance of this up by like 3 times. So for every 1, you can go to 4. So we have 1 megahenry here, 4 here, and as you saw, our LED will get brighter. You can only extend this so far, however, before you have to raise this inductor as well. But if you want to stay more efficient, only raise 1 inductor at a time while you experiment. In my case, a 1:4 ratio is really good, but for everything I've built and shown off in the B-roll, I used a 1 megahenry inductor for both the collector and the base transistor. But one thing I did notice in my simulation program here, it really does not like low current circuits like this, so I gotta raise the inductor up in order to get this to oscillate in the simulation. That's a bit of a bug with this program, I've noticed. But yeah, if you plan to build this as well as replicate what I've shown, some things to note. Some breadboards kinda suck in these components, their leads are really thin in some cases, so if you build this and it happens not to work, just make sure you have everything plugged in correctly, and you should be good. Another thing to note, your inductors should be facing 2 separate directions and be as close to each other as possible. The closer they are, the more magnetically coupled they are, which should make it run a little better. The further they are, the more oscillation you can get. Another weird thing I noticed, in reality, I don't think this would work. You could swap the terminals here in the simulation, and this thing will still oscillate. I haven't tried this on a breadboard yet. I imagine this won't work. I imagine the LED would just look lit, but whatever. I'm going to swap these back around. Anyway, there's the circuit if you do wish to replicate it. Another thing I recommend doing is getting a really low ESR or a really sensitive capacitor. If you can, spring for film capacitors. They're a little expensive and kind of not made no more. I believe they're discontinued, but for a project like this where you're working with low energy, replacing that normal polarized capacitor with one of those would probably improve the efficiency and the runtime of this even further. However, if all you have are capacitors lying around, I recommend using high-grade audio-based capacitors that are built for fast switching. Also, the size of the capacitor doesn't really matter, but what I find works best for me are these 47 UF based capacitors. But yeah, before the circuit simulation goes here, on the right side of your screen, I'll have all of the components listed out that I am using. I believe it's a 2N222A transistor. These are the improved version of the 2N222s, so I recommend these over the other ones. And I also recommend getting these components in bulk, that way you can experiment with the inductant values. But yeah, if you happen to be just listening to this video, down below in the description is the list of the components as well, if you just want to click on the links and go right to where you can buy them. Another thing to note, you don't need any resistors for this circuit to work. The only reason why I have resistors here in the circuit simulator is because this program will think you're trying to do over unity and it will error out because there's a capacitor loop with no resistance. So to simulate the wire resistance as well as the resistance of our battery, I had to put those 2 components in just to get this simulation to function. But yeah, like I said, you don't need no resistors at all. Well, anyway, I just thought this was a really cool circuit, and you could, in theory, attach this to all kinds of things. You could make a skateboard that lights up whenever it's wet. You could do a road sign that just plugs into the ground and it will just function till the metal's pretty much erode away. You could even make gimmicky things. One of the gimmicky ideas I had was to turn a chemical reaction, as in those drinking water birds that you can get that you put on the side of a water cup. Those are typically chemical based, as well as they are driven pretty much off thermodynamics. So they will run as long as the cup is warm, but with a circuit like this, you can get it running pretty much until the metals completely erode away or the electrolyte becomes completely supersaturated. So in theory, if you made a drinking water bird with a circuit like this, it would probably last longer. So that's one thing I want to do, is try to make this into a drinking water bird circuit. Whether I just make the bird's eye light up or rock back and forth will depend on whether or not there's enough energy to make a magnet-driven air coil that can actually propel this thing. But yeah, those are all future projects. I don't have nothing really built right now, so perhaps there'll be a part 2 for this video where I actually put something together with this circuit and show it off. But for the time being, I hope this video taught you something new and maybe showed you something cool. So with that said, I'm gonna leave it off here now. DTPK signing off. Peace. So there was some promise with this miniature cell that I was working on. However, the current...
Be sure to use proper form and technique. This concludes the Budget Assassin's weapon.